The Ministry of Health in Israel is actively hiding critical information about side effects of the vaccines from the Israeli public.
Today I sit down with Levy, an expert in risk management and health systems and a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's co-authored a paper that found a 25% rise in heart attack emergency calls among young Israelis after the country's rollout of the COVID genetic vaccine.
The main question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we have enough evidence from this study and many other studies to say, halt?
Today we take a look at a series of leaked videos that show authorities in Israel, one of the most vaccinated countries in the world, knew much more than they let on about the vaccine's side effects. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Dr. Levy, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you, Jan. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Well, so you have been, I could say, deeply involved in analyzing all sorts of things related to the COVID pandemic over the last few years. Notably, in Nature Scientific Reports, you were a co-author on a paper. I'll get you to explain exactly what it is that you found. It had to do with, an increase in cardiac events. But also, you were one of the investigators looking at this leaked video, Israeli leaked video about side effects, possible vaccine side effects. So we're going to talk about all this. But before we do that, maybe just briefly tell us, your background, and because it's actually really fascinating how it fits into all different aspects of what's been happening over the last few years.
So yes, my background is maybe a little bit unique. I was born in Israel and spent almost 12 years in the military as an intelligence officer, so kind of developed intelligence skill sets. And then shifted careers and came to the US to do a PhD and ended up as a faculty member at MIT. My work over the years has been in the intersection of analytics and modeling with issues like risk management and a lot of work with healthcare systems and other health-related systems, in which I've been looking at a lot of data and often trying to analyze what the data is telling us about quality, safety, risks, and so forth. And clearly when the COVID-19 pandemic has started, I shifted a lot of attention to what is happening. And coming to the specific paper in Nature Scientific Reports that you mentioned, at a nutshell, what this paper found is that when you analyze the national emergency calls of the national EMS service in Israel, you find that in the first 5 months of 2021, you see an increase of 25% in the calls for cardiac arrest and heart attacks among young individuals between the ages of 16 to 39. This is compared to the previous years of 2019 and 2020. This is a period of time when you can actually control for a period when you had only pandemic and then a period when you had a pandemic and vaccines. So when we analyze this increase, we actually found that there is a temporal correlation between this increase starting in early 2021 and the launch of the vaccination campaign in Israel. And specifically, we saw a temporal correlation between the number of doses that were given to this specific age group, 16 to 39, and the number of EMS calls with cardiac arrest and heart attack diagnosis. Interestingly enough, we did not see, or we did not find the same statistical correlation with the number of infections, COVID-19 infections, within the same age group. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a concern that first there is an unexplained increase of some pretty serious healthcare events among young individuals. This is not something that is supposed to happen. And with some even more concerning signal that there is some temporal correlation with the vaccination campaign. Now, just to put this in context, the paper does not have enough data or the right data to conclude that there is a causal relation between the vaccine and the increase that we see. but it definitely calls for a very thorough investigation to understand with more refined data, more refined individual data, what is happening. Unfortunately, one would expect that the Ministry of Health in Israel would embrace this as something that will cause them to initiate an investigation. But the fact and the reality was that they basically launched an attack on us, both in the public domain, as well as even actively trying to approach the journal and ask the journal to retract the paper. This is very unfortunate because the only thing that the paper is doing is highlighting a few facts that are concerning and asks that things will be investigated. And in fact, the paper explicitly says that potentially there could be multiple causes for this increase, including perhaps some role of that could be related or associated with infections of COVID-19. But this temporal correlation that we see with the vaccines seems very concerning, particularly because there is some plausible mechanism of why we would see that.
Right.
Now, what is that mechanism?
Right, exactly.
So we know already, and that's a fact, that everybody agrees on that fact, there is no debate about that fact, that these vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines of Pfizer, this is the primary, almost all of Israeli citizens were vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine. There is absolutely agreement that these vaccines can cause a condition that is called myocarditis, or another condition that is called pericarditis, that these are basically situations when your heart is being inflamed. And in fact, the rates are highest among young individuals, specifically males. But we also know about this condition that often beyond the clinical cases that you can really diagnose because there are symptoms, there are in fact many cases in which there are very vague or even subclinical cases where there are no symptoms. And this is not a concern that I thought about, this is actually a concern that the FDA thought about. So the FDA, when they approved the Pfizer vaccine, asked Pfizer to investigate and do a post-marketing study exactly about subclinical myocarditis among young individuals. Now here's another fact that we know, that often subclinical myocarditis can be a primary cause of sudden death because of cardiac arrest among young individuals. So when you take this known clinical mechanism, this is again not something I thought about, this is a known mechanism based on a long, many years of literature, right? And you connect that with the data that we see in Israel. But not only in Israel, we actually see the same trends we see in other countries like the UK, right? When you connect all of this, you must ask yourself, at the very least, what is going on, and I think you must agree that you have at the very least, to thoroughly investigate what is happening. And unfortunately, that's not what is happening in Israel, and unfortunately, it's also not happening in other countries like the US and the UK.
This is actually incredibly important because, on this show, we've covered, all sorts of scenarios. We've covered, the mechanism around myocarditis and potential relationships with the spike protein and all sorts of things. But we've rarely covered just looking at the various pieces of data and just, thinking to yourself, well, all of this seems to fit together. We should be studying the crap out of this, right? And asking the question, why is that not happening?
Yeah. So just to underscore what you just said, I want to kind of relate to an historical event that is relevant to another vaccine that also caused myocarditis. This is the smallpox vaccine that was also known to cause myocarditis. And in 2015, the American military conducted a pretty large study that the results were published in an academic journal that is called PLOS. And that study was basically prospectively checking people that got the smallpox vaccine and the influenza vaccine before and after they received the vaccine, checking cardiovascular biomarkers to see if you can identify subclinical cases of myocarditis. And what they found was quite striking. they found that for the smallpox vaccine, for which you knew that there is a risk of myocarditis, the rate of subclinical cases was 60 times fold higher than what was the known clinical rate. At the same time, they didn't see any or almost any cases in the flu vaccine. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that some vaccines can cause clinical myocarditis, and it's very likely that those vaccines beyond the cases that we know to diagnose, they cause many more cases. In fact, we already have some initial studies about the Pfizer and the mRNA vaccines that suggest that we see the same issue here. There's a study from Thailand that did something similar to what the American military did and found 7 cases among 201 boys, which again brings us to a rate of 1 to 30, 1 to 50 young males that receive this vaccine that may have some sort of cardiac injury. Now, do we know what the long-term implications of that? No, we don't. But like the American military did at the time in 2015, we are obliged to check these things. And in fact, the decision with respect to the smallpox vaccine was to immediately take it out of the vaccination program of the American military. And here I think that we see something very different, as you pointed out. And when you ask yourself what is different, I think that these vaccines were approved in an unprecedented, speedy process that essentially did not follow the mainstream approach and methodology that we got used to for decades. And once you deviate from what is known, from what is established, you put yourself in a very problematic situation as a regulator, right? Because if something happens, you have nothing to refer to. Because when any vaccine that you deploy after clinical trials, you take into account the risk that there's going to be the possibility that there are going to be harms that you didn't detect in the prior stages, in the clinical trial stages. But at the very least, you feel comfortable that you follow the methodology, the acceptable methodology about how to check this vaccine. But if you didn't do that, and you gave it to millions and billions of people, including young individuals that have very, very tiny risk from COVID-19, then you put yourself in a situation where you essentially cannot admit any wrong anymore, because that will imply that you did something very, very disastrous. And I think that that mental mind has affected the behavior of regulatory agencies across the world. And it all goes back to the origin of how we approve this vaccine and to who we approve this vaccine. We approved it in a very expedited way, and we approved it to everybody regardless of the risk. And that was basically the fundamental mistake that we've done, and I think everything else can be explained by that.
I mean, that's fascinating. We just have this paper that I've been kind of amazed by, this new analysis by John Ioannidis about, just showing the actual risks across, age stratification, and how really for the vast majority of people it was, very, very low. And given the types of information we're getting about vaccine injury, I mean, this subclinical myocarditis study from Thailand, that's almost unimaginable to me. That's a much greater rate than you ever see with vaccines of any sort, right?
Yeah. So the paper you refer to is fundamental, but just to be honest, this is no news. This data, these numbers were known in March 2020, right? We knew these facts from the early stages of the pandemic. And in fact, the risk-benefit of the vaccine was also known from the clinical trial that were conducted. There is a recent analysis or reanalysis of the clinical trials of Pfizer and Moderna by a group of very serious scientists that essentially show us that when you actually look on total medical harm, including deaths and serious hospitalizations and serious adverse events versus deaths from COVID and hospitalizations for COVID, there are far many more harm, there's far much higher harm among the vaccine arm versus the placebo arm. So that should have been already a red flag that at the very least we should not use this vaccine among young individuals that are at a very, very, very low risk, especially if they are healthy. Essentially, they have no risk if they are healthy from COVID-19. And put them in a situation when they take an unknown risk that now we know is actually, in some cases, pretty substantial and could really compromise the future of young people, and including causing their death.
And there's this new study, relatively new study that Surgeon General of Florida, Dr. Joe Ladapo, he basically found 84% increase among a similar age group of young men in myocarditis. In cardiac death.
Yes.
Right, exactly. In response to correlated with. Yeah.
So here's one way. Yeah. Here's one way to understand the study that came out of Florida. It's very intuitive, a very intuitive explanation of the nature of the result, right? So if we assume that the vaccine has no impact on cardiac death, right? So then when we look on when you were vaccinated, and if unfortunately you died after vaccination from some sudden cardiac event, then the temporal distance from the vaccine should basically be completely random. So the chances to get it 2 weeks after the vaccine should be the same as getting it between week 8 and week 10 after the vaccine. And what this study shows that that's actually not the case. That in fact, it's more likely that you're going to have such an unfortunate event in the weeks following the vaccine, right? So that's basically contradicting the initial hypothesis, that the wishful hypothesis that there is no relationship between, or there is no impact between the vaccine and cardiac deaths. Now, is that going to show us a causal relationship? Again, no, but that's not the point here. What is the point? The point is, first, the onus is to show that the vaccine is safe, not to show that the vaccine is not safe. This is a fundamental principle that has been accepted for decades when we thought about how we think about risk benefits of therapeutics, drugs, and vaccines. But secondly, again, you cannot just look on this as an isolated result. You have to look on the overall evidence, I just described it. You have to look on the plausible clinical mechanism that we already know exist. And at the very least, this should just raise your concerns that something really, really disturbing is happening here. I've been on the minority camp in many arguments around this pandemic, but I always tell people that I feel that I'm the main narrative. The people that keep saying about risk benefits, about take the time to really investigate any signal, they represent what would be considered the mainstream up to 2.5 years ago. And I actually think that the regulatory agencies, and with the support of some scientists and the media, are essentially representing a very extreme approach, and a very dangerous approach, if I may say. Because again, they are undermining the fundamentals of proper scientific and medical work. And once this goes away, and once the trust goes away, you're in a very, very dangerous situation. And I'm very, very concerned about the future of science, the future trust in science and medicine.
Just briefly before we continue, did you look closely at this study that was done in Florida?
Yes, I read it.
So, it has been, attacked as being poorly done, shoddy. This is, you know something about looking at these sorts of data sets and studies. What do you think of it?
So the first thing is, as I said, there is no perfect study, and you shouldn't look on one single study when you want to investigate an issue like this. But again, this study just builds on tremendous amount of additional evidence that something very problematic is happening here, right? The technique that they used is a known technique. The data that they used is good data, reasonably good data, and the conclusions that they made are appropriate to the method that they used. If anything, by the way, you could argue that their risk estimates are potentially underestimates. And the reason is that they compare essentially vaccinated people in the first 28 after they got vaccinated and then after 28 days, right? And the underlying assumption that there is a really high risk in the first 28 days to die from cardiovascular outcome. And there is much less of that after that. But if let's assume for a second that maybe the risk is continuing beyond 28 days, then the results that they showed in their study might be actually biased downward. Now, I don't know which is what, but frankly speaking, I don't think that that's the main question here. The main question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we have enough evidence from this study and many other studies to say, halt, we're going to stop these vaccines, definitely for young individuals, but maybe overall, and we're going to take the time to really look very, very carefully and scrutinize every piece of data and bring together every possible piece of data to understand what is the answer, right? That's something we have to do. Now, everybody can speculate what will be the ultimate answer of a process like that, but what is disturbing that we don't agree that we need to check it. And I think that that's what Dr. Ladapo was saying. He was saying, I don't feel comfortable to continue to give these vaccines to young individuals given the evidence that I have. Because the most basic fundamental principle in medicine is first do no harm, right? And clearly they are at a very low risk of harm from COVID-19. So there is no reason whatsoever to take any risk, especially not when you have such a mounting evidence that something potentially is very, very wrong going on here.
Something you said earlier, I was thinking about that. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was an incredible amount of fear. You know, I mean, there's some evidence. Laura Dodsworth, for example, in the UK, found that there were, actually behavioral units, kind of nudging people towards more fear. So there's an incredible amount of fear, perhaps even among the bureaucrats that were making the decisions. And now, where there's a different kind of fear, this is what I'm hearing from you, there's the fear of being found out that you did something terribly wrong, at the very least. Maybe there's other things going on. But fear definitely has been figured as very, very importantly in all of this. And kind of, it's completely changed my thinking about, human motivation and what people are capable of in these kinds of situations.
If there is a lesson I learned during the last 2.5 years is how powerful fear is as a mechanism to impact individuals. What I realized that in many cases it shuts down intellect, rationale, ethics. Scared people can do very, very bad things to each other and even to themselves. And being anchored on one specific source of fear is even worse, right? Because let's just take all the scare and the fear that was used to drive lockdowns, right? I think if you would ask parents and you explain to them what are the implications of their kids not going to school for 2 years, or their parents not being able to hug their grandkids or to see them and be isolated, right? If you would be able to objectively explain this to them, I think that they would be able to make a much more thoughtful choice of how to balance the different risks. But when you anchor and you create fear from one-dimensional risk, getting infected with COVID, right? And again, not to say that COVID cannot be a dangerous illness for some people, right? It can. I want to make sure that that's clear, right? But there are other risks in life, and health consists of so many other dimensions. that I think we just forgot about, many of them, or health authorities and policymakers forgot about all of them. And they really acted driven by fear, and I think that fear was fueled often by scientists and medical professionals that elevated and sometimes, if I may say, manipulated data. Coming back to the paper you mentioned of Ioannidis, that basically tells us the story very clearly, right? This is COVID-19 is very, very risky for older people and people with serious comorbidities, but it's not risky for young people. It's absolutely not risky for children, right? And that fundamental insight should have guided everything that we've been doing, but unfortunately it didn't.
So you've been, teaching in the field of, could we say, risk management?
Among other things, analytics, data, risk management, healthcare, many things.
Right, but basically you specifically have been interested in looking at all these different dimensions that you just described to actually figure out how to make good decisions, right, about them. So you're kind of like the perfect person to look at this and saying, my goodness, these people have a monomania about COVID, and there's all these other things they're completely forgetting about. Now, you were actually asked to, I think, advise on this in a professional capacity, right? So tell me a bit about that and how your advice was met.
So I've been interacting early on during the pandemic, both here in the US with the different states administration and also in Israel with ministers. I'm going to tell you two anecdotes that maybe will tell you the story. So early on in the pandemic, I met with a governor of a state in the US and the health secretary of that state. And that's early March, that's March 2020. And the team that I worked with, we prepared a map with all the nursing homes in the state. And we basically told them, hey, you have to protect these people because they are the most vulnerable, high-risk population. And if you don't protect them appropriately, you're going to have pretty much a disaster. Unfortunately, it took 2-3 months and 2,000 to 3,000 casualties among nursing homes from COVID for them to come back and work with us to develop some protocols of how to better protect nursing homes. The other story is from Israel. So a team that I was involved with, we were the first to essentially present to the government in Israel an analysis of the health damage, the health consequences of lockdowns. I'm not talking about the economic impacts, I'm talking about the health implications. And we used a very common methodology that is called lost years of life, which essentially is exactly the common methodology where you want to compare two potential approaches and you want to see which one of them has more favorable long-term health impact. And what we've been able to show is that lockdowns would cause, in the next coming decades, more than a factor of 10,000 more loss of years of life loss than all the deaths that Israel would experience from COVID-19. And the reason is, and again, every person that dies is a tragedy, right? But most of the people that died from COVID were people over 70 with life expectancy around 3 years. Lockdowns, and especially the way they were implemented and the fact that kids were kept at school, and we already see the health implications of those lockdowns with tremendous rates of mental health issues among kids, eating disorders, sleeping disorders, kids that lost schools, and increase inequity is another factor, right? The lockdowns that we implemented in so many countries around the world and the impact that they had on young individuals and children's health, based on what we know, based on the science that we have for years, are going to cause many young people to live shorter lives and many years of life lost and a number that is 10,000 times higher than the life lost because of COVID. This is not going to be something that is happening in a week. It's going to happen over the next 5 decades. Next 3, three to 5 decades. Because we already see kids with major mental health and eating disorders, right? We know that a child that is falling into that level of problems is supposed to live shorter life. It's known, this is known literature. I'm not making up, this is not my research. This is like known research. I'm just like summarizing the research, right?
And I'm just thinking there's this astounding outcomes where, you know, young people gained an average of, I thought it was like tens of pounds.
Absolutely.
Of,
and we know
morbid obesity.
You're right. And we know there are studies that show that any kilogram, any pound that you gain as a child stays with you and is going to shorten your life. There are studies that show that. And unfortunately, we weren't able to listen to those voices. When we were trying to show this study or to speak about this study to the Israeli government, we were just basically dismissed. And I think that the reason was that we didn't ask the right questions. We didn't put the right objectives that we need to manage by the policies. If you just want to manage the number of infections of COVID-19, then you might be convinced that lockdowns is a very rational policy, but that's a very wrong objective. You should have a multitude of objectives that really capture health, the holistic definition of health. That has to do with mental health, that has to do with older people being isolated. We know that it shortened their life. You need to think about all of these aspects when you devise and implement policies. And unfortunately, we adopted, based on fear, a one-dimensional objective. And even that objective we didn't manage very well, because we know now that lockdowns did not slow the pandemic. We know that as well, right? So not only that we didn't manage to get any progress on the one objective that we focused on, we actually sacrificed many other extremely important objectives that really have to do with the health of the younger people in our society and children. And to me, that's not only a scientific flaw, this is an ethical flaw. This is an ethical failure that as a society, we didn't put the young and the children as a top priority. To me, that's what a society is supposed to do.
You know, Scott Atlas has said a number of times, kind of known for saying this, that, you know, as a society, we used children as shields for adults, and that it's unconscionable. And now what you've just explained to me allows me to understand that at a deeper level, frankly, than I did before.
And just to underscore what Scott Atlas said, it didn't even help. In fact, in many ways, it potentially enhanced the spread of the pandemic. We know that the most powerful mechanism of spreading an infections like COVID-19 is multi-generational households. So what did we do? We kept all the students or university students out of school. We kept them at home. We kept all the children at home. We created exactly multi-generational households. And again, what is striking is that the insights that I share with you now, they are not new. They were known. This is why I'm saying this would be the mainstream response 2.5 years ago. It seems that out of fear, we took the book, we threw it away, and we adopted something that is not science, something else.
We adopted arguably the Chinese communist totalitarian model.
You know, I think that the initial response of China and the lockdowns that they conducted definitely, and the scare that came out of China definitely fueled the scare in the West. I think that we see now in China that this lockdown and zero COVID policy is failing miserably, and I actually think that it potentially going to bring China down economically speaking, and not to mention that in China, I have colleagues in China. I think that there were many people in China locked in their house for a month and a half, not being able to even buy food and buy drugs, medical drugs, right? So this has definitely impacted the response in the West, unfortunately. But I think to just expand on what you just said, I think that we tend to relate human rights to left, right. What I found is that human rights are something that can be supported or dismissed both by the left side and the right side of the political map. And I'm a very apolitical person, I'm a scientist. But what is striking to me is that freedom is a fundamental value of democratic societies, but it's also a fundamental value of science. And when I said that fear often shuts down values and ethics, I think that there is no better example of how fear really causes people that on regular days you would expect them to be voicing and leading with human rights promotion and with freedom. They were the most first-line supporters of some of the most draconian policies that took away human rights from people. The very basic human right of deciding what kind of medical treatment you want or don't want to take, right? But also in the scientific world were essentially imposing censorship mechanisms that I've never seen in my over 16 years as a scientist. I've never seen something close to that. I tend to say that we have new instances of inquisition, scientific inquisition. It's to that level that I think that science has deviated from some of the basic principles of scientific freedom.
At this point, it's sort of the perfect time to jump into this leaked video talking about vaccine harms. We've actually independently verified, of course it's in Hebrew, that we verified that everything is accurate, and in fact we've written a number of pieces with your help, so thank you for that on this. So let's roll the first one.
כאן נצטרך לחשוב גם מדיקו-לגלית. למה מדיקו-לגלית? כי לא מעט תופעות שהיו, אמרנו, אוקיי, זה קיים, יש דיווח, אבל בכל תתחסנו. זאת אומרת, צריך לחשוב איך כותבים את זה ואיך מציגים את זה בצורה נכונה, ולא שיהיו אחרי זה תביעות משפטיות, רגע, אתם אמרתם שהכל יחלום ואפשר להתחסן. והנה עכשיו תראו מה קרה לי.
So, let me just give some background on what do we see here. I'm going to start with a summary, a one-line summary. Like other regulatory health agencies in the world and regulatory agencies in the world, the Ministry of Health in Israel is actively hiding critical information about side effects of the vaccines from the Israeli public. Moreover, the Ministry of Health for the longest time did not really monitor side effects in a very appropriate way and had a very dysfunctional system to monitor side effects of the vaccine. It's important beyond Israel because Israel was essentially the first country to launch the vaccination campaign, the national vaccination campaign, and it did that under a very unique agreement with Pfizer that essentially made Israel a worldwide lab for the rest of the world. And indeed, if you follow all the approval stages of the FDA of the vaccine, in each one of them, Pfizer is quoting and relying on data from Israel, and in fact, in some of them, Israeli officials are presenting to the FDA about, for example, the booster outcomes. Now, what we see here is an internal discussion that was recorded between some senior officials from the Ministry of Health in Israel and a research team that the Ministry of Health itself hired to analyze side effects. Why did they hire this special team? Because only at the end of 2021, a year after vaccination started in Israel, the Ministry of Health finally was able to launch an appropriate system to surveillance side effects and collect reports of side effects from patients. And this is in contrast to what the Ministry of Health was saying publicly, including to the FDA, that they have a very robust system to monitor side effects. So after a year, they were finally able to launch the system, and they basically hire this research team to investigate and study the reports that were received. And what we just heard was part of multiple messages that this research team gave to the Ministry of Health. Here, what they told them is that they were surprised to find out that unlike what was told to the public, and maybe against the existing narrative, many of the side effects are in fact not short-term, but actually last weeks, months, and sometimes over a year. When I say side effects, I talk about menses irregularities, I talk about neurological, serious neurological side effects, and so forth and so forth. And we just heard the head of the research team essentially advising the Ministry of Health officials to think medical legal, because they have a serious problem with potential lawsuits by patients, because they communicated to the public in Israel and to the world that the side effects are rare, and if they happen, they don't last for a long period of time. They go away. And that's not what the data is saying. The data is suggesting that in substantial number of cases, these side effects actually last for many, many weeks, months, and over a year. So he's advising them how to communicate, to think carefully, how do they communicate this to the Israeli public? It seems that the Ministry of Health in Israel took this to their attention, because when you look on the actual report that they post in the public domain, they essentially took out a lot of the messages, a lot of the findings that were found by the research team that they hired. And moreover, they misrepresented the data and misrepresented the reporting rates of the different side effects and made them look like very, very rare side effects, whereas the fact of the matter is that the reporting rates were much higher. How did they do that? They did that by doing two things. They basically ignored the fact that the system was only launched at the end of 2021, a year after the vaccination started. So when they considered the number of reports, they took this number and divided it by the total number of doses of vaccine that were given in Israel throughout the entire period of time. That's clearly manipulative, right? The irony is that when they took the number of reports on menses irregularities, they divided it by the number of doses of men and women. I think that everybody could tell, you don't need to be a scientist to know that that's wrong.
Well, I was going to say, it's either manipulative or a really, really bad error. Right?
I don't think it's a bad error, because even after that was pointed out to them, they never really admitted that there was an error. And they also are hiding from the Israeli public that these reports represent only 15, maybe 17% of the population in Israel. The reason is that the data was collected from, theoretically speaking, from 4 large HMOs, healthcare maintenance organizations. That's kind of how the healthcare system in Israel is set up. It's very different than the US. The fact was that only one HMO was primarily reporting. And essentially, these reports are representing only 6 months out of a year and a half, and only 15 to 17% of the population in Israel, rather than the entire population and all the doses that were given in Israel. When you actually look on these true reporting rates, you actually become very concerned that these are actually quite high reporting rates. And that was another thing that the Ministry of Health kind of manipulated, right? And lastly, the research team was essentially talking about clear evidence that these reports, in many cases, demonstrate causal relationship to the vaccine. Mm-hmm. How did they infer that? They infer that based on a phenomena that is called rechallenge. Mm-hmm. What does this mean? It means that, say I took 1 dose of the vaccine and had a a neurological reaction. And then when I took the second dose of the vaccine, this neurological reaction either came back or became worse. So now I have a situation when every time that I take the vaccine, I see the same response. That is called rechallenge, because the vaccine, every dose of the vaccines is rechallenging the appearance of the side effect. And in which case, it's a common kind of methodology, and we're going to see a video where the head of the research team is explaining that. It's a common methodology to basically conclude there is a causal relationship with the vaccine. Now, this is a system where they actually know the individuals. So the Ministry of Health currently knows that there are people that have clear evidence that they were harmed by the vaccine. So not only that they did not expose the fact that there is an evidence of causal relationship to the public in Israel, they also did not reach out to these individuals to try and compensate them and take care of them, right? So there are many, many failures. And as much as I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that these are maybe innocent errors, it's very hard to believe, given the mounting evidence that there's so many things that were hidden here, that this is something innocent.
הרבה מאוד פעמים לנשים יש שינויים במחזור מכל מיני דברים, מתרופות, מלחץ, מהמון דברים, אבל מה שכן יודעים, וזה איגוד הגינקולוגים אומר בצורה מאוד ברורה, גם אם יש קשר לחיסון, השינויים האלה הם זמניים והם חולפים.
המחזור חוזר להיות.
אז אנחנו לא יודעים אם זה קשור, כי אין לנו את הרקע להשוות, אבל גם אם יש, זה חולף וזה חוזר להיות תקין.
והחלטתי בעצם לשים את הספוט על דיוריישנים שהם מעבר לשבוע, על תופעות ארוכות, שאנשים דיווחו שבעצם השינוי לא היה של מספר ימים או שבוע, אלא מעבר לכך. וסכמתי בעצם את המקרים האלה וראיתי שגם פה יש לא מעט מקרים של הפרעות במחזור החודשי שהן נמשכות לאורך מספר חודשים. ובעצם שוב פעם עשיתי את אותו הדבר, לקחתי והסתכלתי באיזה תופעות מדובר, מהם התופעות שבעצם נמשכות פרקי זמן ממושכים. אז חלק מהאנשים דיווחו שהם לא מקבלות מחזור, שהמחזורים שלהם מאוד כבדים וארוכים, והם לא סדירים מאז החיסון. בסדר, זה נגיד רוב הדיווחים שדיברו על תופעות ארוכות טווח, הם בעצם דיווחו על ההפרעות מהסוג הזה. גם פה היו ריצ'לנג'ים, כ10% מהמדווחות דיווחו שהיה ריצ'לנג', זאת אומרת הבעיה נפתרה, ואז הם חוו את אותם השינויים שוב פעם אחרי שהם קיבלו מנה נוספת. בסדר, אני חושבת ש10% זה כבר מתחיל להיות די יפה, וזה כן מראה על איזשהו, זה מחזק קצת את הקשר בין מה שמדווחות לבין החיסון, אם יש תופעה של ריצ'לנג'. זיהינו את 5 ההפרעות השכיחות, שהיוו 80% מהדיווחים, בנושא הזה של הפרעות במחזור הווסת. חשבנו שהן קצרות מועד, זה מה שהמחקרים עד עכשיו מראים, ואנחנו גילינו שבעצם למעלה מ-90% מהדיווחים שבהם מופיע איזשהו אפיון של משך מדווחים על שינויים ארוכי טווח, כאשר 60% מתוך הקבוצה הזאת מדווחים על שינוי למעלה של 3 חודשים.
Let me see if I've got this straight. This is saying that 90% of the reports that talked about menstrual irregularities were actually of long-term nature.
90% of the ones that mentioned the duration of the phenomena. Okay. Right? So some did not have any reference to that topic, but it's a substantial number. I think that this story is really illustrative of what we've seen around this vaccine, right? Like, if you think back about the very first reports from women about menses irregularities, right? They were immediately dismissed by this is fake news, this is just like misinformation, and so forth and so forth, right? Now what we see at the beginning of the video is Dr. Sharon Al-Roee, who is the #2 healthcare official in the Ministry of Health, interviewing in Israeli TV and basically saying something along the lines, okay, there is a phenomena like that, but it's just short term. Nothing to worry about. Go vaccinate. Now, what this research team has found, and you see that in the conversation, how they report, that the fact of the matter is this is not a short-term phenomena. In fact, there are women that suffer from weeks and months and over a year sometimes of irregular menstrual cycle and different types of irregularities, right? And again, evidence that this is directly caused by the vaccine because of the rechallenge, because that every time that they take the vaccine or another dose of the vaccine, we all know that now we need to take the booster, another booster. Every time that they take another dose of the vaccine, the phenomena or the side effects or the irregularity is coming back or becoming worse, right? And there is no acknowledgement from anybody in the Ministry of Health, there is no acknowledgement that I am aware of from any health authority or health agency in the world. Hey, there is a problem here. Even now, people kind of dismiss, oh, it's a short term, it doesn't have any impact because we don't know the mechanism. There is no plausible mechanism that can, make this happen in a way that has some serious implications. So people say, oh, this cannot impact fertility, right? Frankly speaking, I don't understand how someone can say that when they don't have an explanation how is it happening. So people don't know, but they assume that nothing is wrong. And the worst thing is they ignore the voice of the patient. Like I work with healthcare systems for over 16 years. Patient-centric medicine is one of the things that is being promoted as a fundamental principle of how we should be thinking about medicine, right? So what is more patient-centric, or basic patient-centric, is to listen to what women are saying. So you see, I think that the mental mindset of I cannot admit that anything is wrong is so powerful at the moment that it makes us pretty much cruel, right? Like I think that when so many women are experience this, and some studies and some surveys talk about even 40% of women, I don't know what the exact number, but the numbers are substantial, right? And for such long period of times, how can you not pay attention, investigate, understand the mechanisms, and see what are the implications? And remember, we are giving this vaccine to 17-year-old, 16-year-old girls, right? Are we going to say to ourselves that everything is okay, nothing is wrong, when young women experiencing adverse events like that? It's beyond me to understand why are we taking that approach, other than if we are very much in the mindset that we have to deny any harm.
From what I've understand, at least from what I've read, this type of information has been coming from multiple different sources, including from the actual Pfizer data sets themselves. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that the trend of, unfortunately, we see a trait across many countries, and the US, Israel, and to some degree other countries, where health agencies are holding back critical information that under, what one would expect should have been released long ago and be analyzed, not only released, right? So both the FDA here in the US and the Ministry of Health in Israel, it takes sometimes to take them to court to make them release data. Like we've seen that with the documents of the clinical trial of Pfizer, that it took a federal court law to force them to release it against their initial intention to keep it for 75 years. You ask yourself why you don't think that it's relevant now. You see that with the Israeli Ministry of Health, that very recently there was a court law, a court order to basically, that forces the Ministry of Health to release to the public data on all-cause mortality across different age groups. Again, these are things that you would expect are health outcomes that health agencies across the world would not only reveal publicly and let scientists analyze, but will analyze them, the data themselves, and allow the public to understand what are the risk benefits of these vaccines, what is the impact of these vaccines on all-cause mortality and other health outcomes, in a way that is informative, that people can make their risk-benefit decision based on their age, health background, beliefs, whatever. But this is unheard of, that health agencies behave in a way that you need to take them to court to release data.
Well, and you actually, you would think if you truly believe that these vaccines are quote unquote safe and effective, you would do the study to prove it, right?
Of course.
And then you would, and in fact, you would help, you know, sort of allay all these fears which have been created through what you call so-called misinformation, right? How weird.
Yes, I think it's hard to explain. I think that when you think about what makes public health policies successful, what are the principles that we all believed are fundamental to the success of public health policies? Transparency, trust, and empathy were our three fundamental principles, right? We lost transparency, as we can see. As a result, we lost trust. And the problem is that we also lost empathy. And I think that there is no better illustration of how much we lost empathy in the way we treat vaccine-injured people, right? The commitment to take care of people that get injured from vaccines is fundamental to the success of vaccine programs. In fact, the more pro-vaccine you are, you should be promoting that stronger, because no vaccine, even the best vaccines, and there are very important vaccines that are extremely important for public health, but no vaccine is 100% safe. There is always harm or risk of harm. And if we are not, as a society, we are not committed to take care and acknowledge and compensate the people that are injured by the vaccines or by any vaccine, we are essentially undermining the ability to have successful vaccine programs going forward. And the data from Israel is very, very powerful about this, right? So Israel traditionally has 98% adherence to all traditional vaccines. So essentially, everybody in Israel gets vaccinated. When you look on the first 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, right, we've seen above 80%, close to 90%, depending on the age group, adherence, right? When it came to the third booster, we already saw less than 50% adherence. And now, when we talk about the bivalent booster, we are talking about 2-3%. I think that illustrates to you what is happening. And this is in an environment when the Ministry of Health has full control in the media, full control to do whatever they want, and the only explanation is that they lost the trust of people. And I think that, unfortunately, that's true for other countries, including the US. And they lost it because they did not maintain transparency, because they did not maintain trust, because they were caught themselves spreading misinformation, like saying, for example, menses irregularities, it's short term, without knowing really that it's short term, right? And maybe above all, they don't show empathy. They don't show empathy to people that took the vaccine and got injured. What can make someone call these people anti-vaxxers or misinformation spreaders, right? Again, I hate the term anti-vaxxers because I think it's a diminishing term that should not be used against anybody, but definitely it's insane to use that against someone that got injured from the vaccine that they actually took. So I think that we need to go back to the basics and restore trust, and we will be able to do that only with transparency and empathy. And I think we are missing both at the moment, unfortunately.
You know, one of the things that I find kind of paradoxical here, I was inclined early in the pandemic to really trust the Israeli data. The reason, I'll tell you, is that, well, because for Israel, let's just say it's kind of the health of the population is kind of an existential question. That's how I see it. So I'd figure if anyone's going to get it right, Israel's going to get it right. Right? Well, you're telling me a very different story.
You probably were right to have that assumption for other reasons as well, because Israel also has an amazing healthcare system. We have an amazing doctors, and we also have a national health system that, unlike the US, it's very, in the US you don't really have a health system, right? You have a separated hospital systems that are not really connecting to each other. In Israel, you have a national healthcare system. You have data on every patient for decades. You have great small countries, best logistics, right? And unfortunately, what happened is, again, maybe driven by fear, Israel signed an agreement with Pfizer that when you read that agreement, most of this agreement is not exposed to the public, but part of it is exposed. And that agreement basically has a goal, and when you read the goal, you have to be puzzled. The goal says, the goal of the collaboration is to see what will be the needed vaccination rates to achieve vaccine-induced herd immunity. So when you read that, you essentially understand that at this moment, Israel basically took the boundaries that should exist between the regulator and the vendor, Pfizer and the Ministry of Health, right? And completely took it out and created a very blurry situation where suddenly the Ministry of Health in Israel is adopting an agenda that is not necessarily aligned with the interests of the people in Israel. And what is more striking, that in this agreement, there is a lot of discussion about collecting a lot of data about infection rates, vaccination rates, severe illness from COVID, but there is no mentioning of side effects. So if you understand this context, you essentially have to conclude that willingly or unwillingly, consciously or subconsciously, right? I don't think that the Israeli officials, the leaders of the Ministry of Health in Israel, could be objective about this vaccine. And moreover, they actually wrote together with Pfizer people articles about the vaccine in the academic literature. So this is a completely distorted situation, and that might explain the aggressive vaccination policies that Israel has launched. Many boosters. In Israel, we have 4 boosters. In Israel, our green passports were actually conditioned on receiving a 3rd booster. And unfortunately, they also promoted this idea of boosters and the idea of vaccination in the US. And I have to say, it was a known fact. Everybody that knew the healthcare system in Israel knew that the system that we had until the end of 2021, for the first year of the vaccination campaign, to monitor side effects was completely dysfunctional. Medical doctors would have told you this privately. Patients had basically a form that allowed them 20 characters to report on the side effects, or 20 words, right? So this was a completely dysfunctional system, and nevertheless, when they presented to the FDA expert committee, they wanted to give the impression that everything is under control, we monitor the data. Unfortunately, that was not the case. As we know, only at the end of 2021, they even had a system. And even after that, they did not analyze all the data. In fact, this research team that I mentioned before, end of May 2022, their contract was basically terminated in spite of the fact that we know that a lot of the data was not analyzed yet. So no collection until the end of 2021, and even beyond that, no real analysis, and definitely no transparency in exposing the data to the Israeli public.
And then potentially spurious analysis because of these gaps in the data.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the next video we can actually see, it's taken partially from the discussion that the FDA had with its expert committee on the approval of the 3rd booster.
I have to say that I was pretty surprised with Retta Flevy's comment that Israel doesn't follow adverse events. It's our data. I'm in charge of it. So I know exactly what is being reported to us.
If Dr. Elroy Price is the one in charge of the adverse events reporting system, Why then, even though she has been aware since March of the findings from the study commissioned by the Ministry of Health itself, and even though the research team prepared a detailed presentation intended for the public, why then has this presentation not been published to this very day?
אז פה זה פילוח שעשיתי ובעצם ראיתי שהיו פה טמטונים, היו פה היפואסטזיות, סחרחורות מתמשכות, פרסטזיות וכולי, שרובן כאמור היו ארוכות יותר מ3 חודשים. בסדר, היו גם דיווחים של מעבר ל-12, ב-65 מקרים, 65% מהמקרים לא היה בעצם את הסוף. הם אמרו כבר 5 חודשים כואב לי, באמת אבל נועה, המצגת הזאת, המצגת שעשיתי למרץ, הייתה הרבה יותר מפורטת ומסכמת במלל את מה שרואים בגרפים, כי ידעתי שהיא מיועדת לציבור. אני כל כך מרוצה שסוף סוף אצלה, כי אני הרגשתי כל הזמן שאני רואה את הדברים האלה, הרגשתי כבר איסורי מצפון, שאנחנו לא משקפים את זה.
So in fact, we did, as you know, reach out to the Ministry of Health and ask them about the veracity of these videos, whether they were real and accurate. We didn't get a response, but later Reuters reached out and they basically said, yes, this was true, but that perhaps they were somehow taken out of context. What's your response?
Yeah, so, and by the way, I want to take the opportunity and really acknowledge Dr. Yafa Shiraz, who is a prominent Israeli journalist that exposed this story to the public and worked also with the Epoch Times people. She reached out to the Ministry of Health multiple times and also to the research team to get a response. The story with the fact-checkers of Reuters is quite striking. In fact, I reached out to their fact-checkers at some point and I showed them the parts of the videos, some of them we just watched, and I told them, hey, there is a story here. Why don't you validate this? So they reached out to the Ministry of Health, and they still refused to respond, right? So then they came back to me, and they basically told me, we are not going to write about this because the Ministry of Health does not respond. When I asked them, the fact that they don't respond cannot protect them, right? Like, why would that protect them? They say, these are our rules, okay? So I moved on, and then one day I kind of open my, my email and I get a link to a fact checker by Reuters that essentially somehow got a response from the Ministry of Health now and then wrote a complete piece on this, not asking for our response. That basically presents this as taken out of context and misinformation. So that tells you something about their ethics and how they work. Maybe it connects to the fact that the until recently CEO of Reuters and now the chair of their foundation is on the board of Pfizer. Maybe it has something to do with that. But nevertheless, just to get the facts straight, I think that anybody that watches this leaked video as a whole, during the discussion, some of the researchers are actually expressing concern that these findings are not known to the public, and they even say that their conscience bothers them. And we are going to hopefully very soon expose the entire video, the entire discussion to the public, and it's going to be very, very clear that nothing was taken out of context. These are the facts, and I think I suggest my friendly advice to the Ministry of Health in Israel is to start addressing the facts, because I think they owe some explanations to not only the Israeli public, but also to the medical professionals in Israel, to the scientists in Israel. I think most of them, their heart is in a good place, and in a good place, and they want to actually know the truth. And I think we all want to know the truth. That's the only thing that we need to aspire, right? We just want to know the truth, the facts. And we're going to do that by exposing the data and analyzing it in a scientific manner, in a very cautious manner, but we need to know the truth.
Ratzef, as we finish up here, maybe just tell me a little bit about how, you've given me examples of, it's basically very bad responses from the press. You've given me examples of healthcare authorities not listening to your advice even after asking for it, or at least not for a while. But professionally, what has been the impact of you taking this what you would call the mainstream approach that no one else seems to be taking, right?
So first, I don't think it's no one else. I think there are many, many serious scientists that I'm proud to interact with that take the same approach that I take, or very similar.
Okay, but let's call it a very, very small minority, though.
So I would even push on that. I don't know to what extent they are minority. They are not being heard because there is a very powerful censorship mechanisms in social media, in the media, in some of the academic journals. But they do exist, and their numbers are going up all the time as we speak.
Okay.
I think that that's a misconception. I think that the narrative that there is only a minority that doesn't agree with the narrative is false. I think that you look on the Barrington declarations, there were actually more people signing it than the alternative that kind of supported lockdowns, right? So I think from the very beginning, and that might be part of the problem, that there was an attempt to basically say we need to have public policy that is not hesitant, and we are representing the science, whereas, and some consensus, perceived consensus that never existed. And I don't think it exists now, and in fact I think that now more and more people realize that something is wrong here. So to me personally, this has been a journey. I've been exposed to things that I've never been exposed to in terms of some dynamics that I didn't think that exist or could exist. You know, luckily in my direct community, COVID is not such a major issue, but when I interacted with the medical community, with whom I work for many years now, and with other communities, I've seen some quite powerful mechanisms of censorship that were very disturbing. You know, the paper that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation today, you know, a week after it was published, by the way, it was invited by the journal to be submitted, went through a rigorous review process like any academic publication, got published, and then a week later it was attacked in social media, but also multiple groups actively and still actively trying to retract this paper. Where the only thing that the paper is claiming, we have to check, there is a potential concerning signal, please check. We are using the most reliable data from the national EMS in Israel based on the diagnosis of the EMS teams in the field. And then you suddenly see, you know, I joke, they throw the kitchen and the sink at you with the hope that something will stick and the paper will be retracted. So that was disturbing. But at the same time, I never felt more comfortable that what I and many others are doing is the right thing to do. And I'm a father of 6 children, and I don't see any other way, because the ability to trust science, the ability to trust the medical authorities, the medical systems, and medicine, right? I'm a great believer in medicine and science, right? That's kind of my life. If this is not going to sustain, and if we are going to also compromise fundamental values like human rights, the ability of someone to decide for themselves, if we are not going to put young people and children at the top of our value system, right? Then if I didn't do anything that I can do to make it right, I'm not a good father. That's kind of the way I see that. So it's clear to me what I need to do. It's not easy all the time, but in some ways it's easy because you just don't have any other choice.
Well, Dr. Retzef-Levy, such a pleasure to have you on the show.
It was a pleasure talking to you tonight.
Thank you all for joining Dr. Retzef-Levy and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek. Israel's Ministry of Health did not immediately respond to a request for comment.